I'm a DiCaprio fan.
Did you peep the new movie that came out with Paul Thomas Anderson?
Nope.
So what's your favorite DiCaprio movie then?
Probably The Revenant. If I had to pick one.
I have actually never seen that
Yeah.
movie. So
But I like him for his versatility.
what do you mean?
Well, so my four favorite movies by him, one of them, he plays a guy who doesn't talk from the fucking north, like a fucking tribe person. And then one of my four favorite movies, he's a fucking spaghetti western actor in Los Angeles.
Oh, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood you're talking about?
Yep. In one of them, he's a fucking slave owner from the South.
Django.
And then in one of them, he's a fucking shady salesman from New York. And he's equally good. Wolf of Wall Street.
Oh, okay.
And in all of those, he's equally good. That's inconceivable. Like, he literally has just done things in acting. Because almost every other actor, I can think of other actors who have done what they did, just maybe to lesser or more degrees. With DiCaprio, I'm like, there's no one that even is in that category that could ever even think about doing
So you're
that
saying
type of range. Like,
you're saying DiCaprio is your GOAT actor?
And it's like not even by, like, it's zero diff. Like, he clears. Like, to me, he's so far ahead of everybody else. Like, there's not a conversation. I won't even entertain another answer.
Wow. I feel like
There might be one other one.
Go ahead.
Meryl Streep, but that's the only one.
Interesting choice. There's a very big range between those two actors.
I like them both for the same reason. That's why I'm like, ooh. Now that I think about it, maybe he's not in a category on his own. Maybe Meryl Streep has to be in there too because her versatility is insane as well.
I'm trying to think of an answer that would be better than that, but I can't. Like, as far as it depends on how you define a good actor. That's the whole problem. It's another epistemological question, you know? Like, what constitutes a good actor? Because if it's just like outreach, then I'll give it to Leonardo DiCaprio, and like range and just like big movies. But I'm sure other actors have played their part better than Leo has played any of his parts, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, do you think that he deserves more Oscars than he has?
I don't really believe in the Oscar, to be honest. Like, I think most movies that are in selection for Oscars like aren't really reflective of the best films.
Do you think he was the best actor? Do you think that he was the best actor in his film compared to his competition during those times?
I'd have to genuinely see who he was. Do you know who he was snubbed by? I would have to see who he was snubbed by, honestly.
Because yeah. No, I don't know either. No, it's a good question. It's a valid question, right? Like, maybe he didn't deserve to win. I think I just think the fact that everybody was talking about how many Oscars he should have means that, okay, so he was in the conversation for the best actor in all of these different types of roles. That in and of itself is objectively incredible. No one else has done that.
Yeah, it's like a Jordan thing. You can't argue with the rings, you know. But
you can't argue with 6 for 6.
But if you want to bring up rings, then people will start talking about awards. But I don't constitute awards to be equivalent to rings. You know, like, I don't view the amount of Oscars you won as an indicator for how good you are as an actor, because I think it's very political.
No. Would you say that if somebody's in that conversation for all of those different roles, that's kind of like at least an indication that they were very, very good enough to warrant recognition from the public?
For the most part, I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah. So that he might not have been the best at those times where he might have been. I think best case scenario, he was in several of them, and then worst case scenario, he wasn't for any of them.
Mm-hmm.
But even just being in the conversation for that vast array is just wild to me.
Yeah.
To be elite at everything. Because I've never seen a movie that he's not been good, that he's even struggled or broken sweat.
I don't know. I didn't like Don't Look Up.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. So you might have me there. No, did you ever see The Departed?
Yeah. See, I used to love that movie when I was in high school, and last time I saw it, I was very underwhelmed by it.
Underwhelmed?
Yeah, I loved it when I first saw it. It was in my top 4. Like,
I'm like that for most of my favorite movies though. Like, Whiplash is my favorite movie of all time, and I'm pretty sure it's still my favorite movie of all time, but it's underwhelming when I watch it again.
It's a very good movie. Sometimes movies can be phenomenal, but they're movies that you really should only see once in your life.
Yeah. I think Whiplash is a solid 2 or 3 watcher, and then that's it. But I think also it has to do with how much distance is between you and the person that you were when you saw it originally.
Yeah, that's definitely true. If you had to go top 3 movies before we get started, what is it? All time.
Whiplash is number 1.
I just put it in my letterbox. Whiplash is in my top 4. So how about that? Yeah, I don't know if I still put it in my top 3, but it was in my top 4.
It's gotta be, dude. It's gotta be on everyone's Rushmore, dude. It's in so many ways. It was just era defining, bro. It was a unique genre. You know, the way that it combined the drama. Anyways, the psychological thrill, all that shit. Anyways, that's gotta be number 1 for me. Number 2 is probably The Shining. Going old school.
You're a Kubrick fan?
And I am a Kubrick fan.
I like Dr. Strangelove the most, bro.
Really? I haven't seen that one. Have you seen Eraserhead? No. I haven't.
That's David Lynch.
Yeah. But like the similar concepts, you know,
Absurd as hell. Yeah, love it.
just like but yeah,
I like Twin
stairs.
Peaks, bro. I like Twin Peaks. I like all of David Lynch.
Oh, that's fire. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know too much. I'm not like what is it? A cinephile?
Yeah.
I just like I like what I like, and I like the weird shit. You know. So definitely, The Shining is up there, and then I would have to say because I also want to put Silence of the Lambs, but that's like redundant, so I'm not going to. And I also want to put American Psycho in there, but again, I feel like that's a little bit redundant, so I'm not going to. So I think for number 3, I'm going with sorry. Number 3, I gotta go with the Joker.
What? All right, I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to like strongly disagree with you on that one. Have you ever seen Taxi Driver?
That was Robert De Niro,
Yeah, have you ever seen it?
right? Yes. Yeah, I have. Oh, you know what? No. 3's for me has got to be Train Spotting, bro.
Oh, okay.
I forgot.
Now I respect that, bro.
But if I had to put a 4, it would be that. It would be the other one.
I respect Train Spotting. You gotta watch the second Train Spotting, dude.
Yeah, I do.
Not as good as the first, but no. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, let's get into what we were going to talk about today, right? Neuromechanical matching. That's what we're here to discuss now.
Yep, that is what we're here to discuss. I'm with Coach
That's the enchilada.
Coach Aaron.
Yeah, that is me, and I am here with Enzo.
All right, so do you want
this podcast?
You want to get into what like the current representation of neuromechanical matching is currently in the science-based lifting sphere?
Sure. Yeah. So my understanding of the current, representation of neuromechanical matching in the science-based lifting sphere is that the only person who really touts it as the end-all be-all of motor unit recruitment and how the body decides what regions to turn on. This is Beardsley's baby. If we really go back to it now, he'll say that this is just in the physiology, and every physiologist believes this. Who's serious? It's like I don't think so. I don't think that's true. So we'll credit this to Beardsley. As far as how it's represented in the science-based lifting community, the way I've seen everybody represent it, it's a very specific hypothesis. And the hypothesis is this, so it's falsifiable. So credit to Beardsley for that. This is a very falsifiable hypothesis. And it is that the absolute determinant of what region of a muscle or what selection of motor units gets activated from the central nervous system is entirely dependent on mechanical advantage. And the way that Beardsley defines mechanical advantage is leverage. That's the whole thing. It's quantified by leverage, right? The length of the muscle's internal momentum, right? So just to simplify it for the audience who might not understand what that is already, because there are people who don't really know what leverage is, right? When I first heard leverage, I thought that meant external leverage, right? But we're talking about internal leverage. So what does that mean? So imagine your joints, right? Like a door hinge. Okay. So this door can open up, right? This is like your limb moving about that joint axis right there. Now I can pull it at the handle right here and apply a lot of torque for very little efforts, or I could try to pull it from very close to the hinge and I could still get it, but I would have to apply a lot more effort or force to achieve the same amount of torque. So that's what leverage is. The idea is that, the more closer or the farther away a joint inserts from its axis of rotation, the more mechanical advantage it's going to have. And so that muscle, that set of motor units, whatever that set is, and they're usually grouped together in bundles, that gets activated by certain motor neurons. Those motor units are going to be the ones that receive activation first. And then Henneman's size principle kind of fits within that, where once it determines the region, it then determines the size of the motor units that are going to be involved afterwards. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So you mentioned that Beardsley's definition of mechanical advantage is solely internal momentum length, correct?
Solely internal momentum length, which means we're defining this as a fixed concept, basically. Right. Your internal momentum length can only be one thing, meaning that at any given joint angle, I can only have one internal moment for a certain fiber. Mm-hmm. Meaning that there is no accounting for if I'm doing an action that takes me from here to here, right? We're going to assume that the body is going to take into account what has the most leverage here and activate that first. Mm-hmm. And then I guess according to Beardsley's hypothesis, those motor units would drop off as you go through the task.
Now, one of the bigger papers that he cites as evidence for this is a principle of neuromechanical matching for motor unit recruitment in human movement, which is the study of the respiratory muscles.
That was the Hudson and Butler study.
So the way that they define mechanical advantage seems to contrast the way Beardsley seems to describe it.
Yeah, so we have a little bit of confusion in the literature with what mechanical advantage really means, because again, we have to take into account contextual definitions, right? Meaning that, so if leverage changes throughout a joint movement, which we know it does, right? That means that if I do, let's say like a bicep curl, an elbow movement right here, that means that at different points during that joint angle or at different points in that range of motion, different joint angles, different motor units or different muscle fibers will have more or less leverage. And so therefore, according to neuromechanical matching, they should receive different motor unit activation, right? But the mechanical advantage that's used by Hudson and Butler in their analysis, and also in the Kawakami paper that they referenced with the calf study, the way that they define mechanical advantage, they're taking into account the whole movement, the dynamic contraction itself. So what they're actually measuring is for a certain amount of joint rotation, okay, passive joint rotation, that is. So let's say I take my elbow from here and I just move it here with my hand. How much length change is there per fascicle in the muscle that we're concerned with? Okay, so that's a very different definition of mechanical advantage because that's a measure of something that happens from here to here, right? We're taking everything into account.
So where would you say the biggest distinction is between these two measurements for mechanical advantage?
When we're discussing like mechanical advantage, okay, what we're basically talking about is how much does the muscle fiber have to shorten to produce a certain amount of movement from the joint. Okay, what we're talking about with leverage is how much effort is required to overcome inertia in that specific joint angle by a certain muscle, right? So it doesn't account for any changes that might happen along the way.
Right.
And so what you can see is in the Kawakami cast study that we're going to link, the way that Butler and Hudson calculated mechanical advantage, they simply took a ratio of the joint angle change and the fascicle length change. That's pretty much it. That's what Kawakami measured in that paper. They didn't even measure internal moment arm length.
So which do you consider to be the more efficient measurement of mechanical advantage?
So that's a good question, right? So I'm not a physiologist,
Yeah.
And I'm not a biomechanist, right? That's not my area of expertise. It's just my area of obsession, right? So I don't have a degree in this stuff. I haven't gone and studied it in a lab. I haven't gone and measured this stuff. But to my untrained eye, it seems a lot more, I guess, coherent to operate with the second definition of mechanical advantage, right? Because what we're interested in is a dynamic movement. Right. So I can very well see that leverage plays a big part, especially in, the initial phases of a dynamic contraction. But if we're doing something, especially like lifting, where we're going to have a slow rep speed and there's going to be levels of activation at different points during the movement, right? We should see kind of like a motor unit recruitment pattern that kind of reflects that, right? We should see a very clean pattern of, okay, this is biceps. And then as soon as it gets here, it turns into brachialis or sorry, the other way around, brachialis, then biceps. Then once it gets high enough, it turns into brachioradialis. But that's not what we tend to see. And also, it just doesn't have any way of taking that actually into account and putting it up against the real world, right? When we look at mechanical advantage as a literally like what it is, which is how much force did this muscle fiber actually have to apply in order to produce a certain amount of torque at a joint? We're thinking about how much force it has to produce over the course of the movement. That's what the body cares about, right? The body, if it's doing a dynamic contraction, isn't thinking about efficiency from one standpoint, right? It wants to complete the task.
Right.
So I think that it might cover a little bit more ground than internal moment arm length, even though internal moment arm length might be a little bit more precise of a way to calculate mechanical advantage in specific phases of a movement, or maybe in actions that have a very limited range of motion anyway, such as like finger flexion, right? Which we'll get into the study that talks about finger flexion.
And it's also very important to note that the original hypothesis that the authors proposed in 2009 was that the central nervous system takes into account the mechanical effectiveness of a muscle when executing involuntary tasks, not that it's the sole factor or determinant. And obviously, as we know, muscles have nonlinear force properties, and there are plenty of other factors that may come into account that aren't just simply the mechanical internal moment arm efficiency of a muscle. Because as we know, there is such thing as a length tension relationship, which makes muscles operate in a way very different to rubber bands and springs, which we see on the internet being brought up all the time.
Right. They're not uniform. So that's the first problem, is that it's not like a rubber band or spring where it's just like all one material and they're just all connected. Like if you imagine a rubber band, basically a rubber band is going to be limited by the strength of any single one of its like component parts. Meaning if I take a rubber band and I put a little tear in it, right, a little nick in that rubber band, the whole strength of that rubber band is now limited to the strength of that one part that I nicked a little bit, and now has a lower force production capability, right? So now if I stretch it past a certain point, it's going to snap. The whole thing's going to snap because of that one weak link in the chain. If that were how a muscle worked, then we wouldn't need different fibers. You know what I mean? Like it wouldn't matter that we have threshold fibers and low threshold fibers, because we will always be limited by the weakest link in the chain. So obviously it doesn't work like that, right? Muscles transmit force laterally. You got the muscle fibers inside of this longer sheath, and they grab onto the sheath and they shorten the sheath, right? But it's not like they're pulling on each other like links in a chain, right? So the force is by the muscle fibers transmitted outwards laterally. So this is what the hypothesis by Beardsley is basically saying. It's a very clear linear progression. According to the model that he's presenting, the central nervous system is selecting for metabolic efficiency. So this all kind of goes back to like an evolutionary biology framework, where the idea is less efficient organisms wouldn't really survive. And so the nervous system is going to select for efficiency because that's how we survive. And by efficiency, we're always talking about energy efficiency, because that's like the key to survival. It's all about energy, right? And so what we're trying to do is, according to neuromechanical matching, minimize the amount of ATP usage for the amount of joint torque that's involved. So a muscle with higher per physiological cross-sectional area, is that going to be more metabolically efficient to produce force, or is it just going to produce more overall force and you have to just activate it more, right?
That's a pretty good point. I'm not sure, to be honest. So that could be a factor. Well, my understanding of it is that if you were to take two muscles competing for the same joint action, and one of which has, say, half the leverage in total moment arm length of another, but the other one would have more than twice the physiological cross-sectional area, it's possible that the CNS may preferentially recruit the muscle with the overall total higher production of torque due to the cross-sectional area, but that is also task dependent. So it depends, because it is also a higher overall total metabolic cost, but the CNS may override what is the most efficient for the metabolism.
Yes, and that's what I think.
Yeah.
And Enzo, I have a very specific reason why I think that.
Why is that?
Because there's something that just tickles my fancy when it comes to this subject that I feel like nobody's been able to answer particularly well thus far, and that is, why is it that the voluntary activation deficit exists, right, as a way to prevent us from activating everything at once that has leverage, because that would just be too much energy, right? That's just the perception of effort. It's too much, right? It's too high, right? And according to Beardsley himself, the perception of effort is a fatigue mechanism. All fatigue mechanisms are related to the fact that your body is trying to put a buffer on how much energy you expend so that your muscle doesn't run out of ATP and then die, right? So let's just assume all that's true. Why is it that I can activate barely 90% or so of my elbow flexors, for example, but I can activate, let's say, I don't know, 80%, 75% of my quads, when that 75%, 80% of my quads is more muscle mass than that 90%. Why can't I activate all of my elbow flexors? This was all about energy, right? So there must be a task dependency, because obviously if my body only was able to use the amount required to move my elbow, right, if it was only allowed to use that much, I couldn't do anything with my legs. Right? It has to be task dependent in some way. So as Beardsley likes to say, let's tug on that thread a little bit, right? Let's tug on that string and see where it takes us. Well, if the body is task dependent, then are we really going to say that it's going to select for metabolic efficiency the same way in a maximal effort that it will in non-maximal effort? Right? And Beardsley has directly addressed that. He said, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a max out effort or if it's not. But I don't think his explanation for why it was sufficient.
And it is also important to note that almost all of the literature that does support neuromechanical matching is in submaximal conditions. So it's possible.
Yes.
It's possible that smaller fatigue-resistant, well-spurred muscles that are often type 1 dominant get recruited first in low-force endurance tasks. It's because there the ATP cost per newton of torque matters the most. So the system would prefer metabolic efficiency. But in like a high-force or explosive task, even if a bigger muscle with a shorter moment arm is less efficient metabolically, it still has the absolute capacity to keep generating force at high levels. So the CNS may possibly trade metabolic efficiency for mechanical robustness. Like if we were to think about like shoulder extension, right? Think about like a row for the lats. Neuromechanical matching tells us that the rear delts have the greatest relative leverage to extend the shoulder in pretty much all degrees of range of motion. So according to neuromechanical matching, we would maximize our rear delt recruitment before the lats are even recruited, correct?
Theoretically, yeah. Well, in theory, because remember, the leverages are based on averages, right? And again, it changes depending on you know what I mean, where you are in the range of motion. But all that aside, there's averages, right? So what people who say that neuromechanical matching is absolutely true, what they will say is that there are certain fibers in the lats that have more leverage than certain fibers in the rear delts, and those might receive activation first, so it might not always be perfect one-to-one. You see what I'm saying?
I understand.
But overall, yes. Like theoretically, it's in order of leverage first and then size. It's like, imagine you have a certain amount of muscle fibers available. The body will say, okay, out of all these muscle fibers, these have the best leverage. These. And it doesn't matter whether they're from the lats, the rear delts, whatever muscle group. It just says these are the motor units that have the. And then from there, it'll say, okay, how much effort do I have to spend? And then it will allocate that in terms of size.
Interesting. So I guess my question may be out of ignorance, but I would just be curious because it seems like just due to the rear delts having such a smaller PCSA than the lats, I find it hard to believe that in those first few reps of shoulder extension, the rear delts are taking the majority of that load and are able to move that same amount of load similarly to the lats. Maybe this is just a question of ignorance, though. I'm not sure.
I don't think neuromechanical matching is saying that it has more force production capacity. I think it's saying that it has more force production capacity per unit of energy.
Okay.
So it might not be doing more absolute work than the lats, but one could argue that it's doing more work for the amount of energy that it's costing, and therefore the body is preferentially activating it first.
Okay, that seems to make sense.
Yeah, which that does make sense if we accept A, that it's all about metabolic efficiency all the time, and B, that it doesn't matter that at different degrees of motion, different degrees in the range of motion, the length to tension relationship is different, the pennation angles are different, and all of those things affect lateral force transmission and other mechanical properties that would change the efficiency of the movement.
Now, what are some reasons that we would have to assume that there may be a difference in recruitment between a 1 rep max effort and like a 20 rep max effort?
I think the idea mainly is that, we're accumulating so much fatigue to get to that 20 rep max that we're going to be involving other systems like the cardiovascular system, and we're just going to be creating afferent feedback from so many different sources that it's like, this is our maximum tolerable perception of efforts, and we can fill all of that with just force production, the corollary discharge from force production, or we can fill that with, 80% of that is the corollary discharge, and then 20% of that is going puffing, feeling in pain and dealing with the burn, all that shit.
But could metabolic efficiency be more relevant for the central nervous system in a set of 20 compared to a set of 1 maximal effort?
Right. And you know what? And I think that's probably the case. Again, it's task dependent, right? The body knows when you're sandbagging. I think it knows when you are not putting in 100% effort. I think I know, because it has sensors not only to determine effort, it has the corollary just feedback, but it also has the Golgi tendon organ, which senses, pressure or force at certain ranges of motion, right? So because it has literally the ability to understand how much effort you're putting in, I think that it understands in some sense, right, the task that you're doing. I think that when you go and pick up a barbell and you go to do a set of 20 barbell curls, I think it knows that, not knows, but I think it can kind of, your central nervous system kind of in a very rudimentary way pieces together. Okay, we're doing, we're doing a task that's going to require more metabolic efficiency here. We're going to want to cycle these cross bridges in a way that's going to stave off the accumulation of metabolites so that we can complete this task more efficiently. And I don't think that those come into play at all during like a 1 rep max. So I think that's a great point. Yeah.
And I mean, it's also important to note that if we're talking about metabolic efficiency, a huge factor in that is the length tension relationship. And a muscle's force,
I think so.
And a muscle's force capacity depends on its sarcomere length during the movement. Each muscle has an optimal sarcomere operating length for force production. And if a muscle is too shortened or too stretched, it can't produce peak internal force. So the CNS may possibly favor a muscle in certain conditions that's at a more optimal length tension state, even if another muscle has a better moment arm in that instance. For example, if you were to consider a movement where a certain joint angle, muscle X has huge moment arm, but it's extremely shortened, thus relatively weak at that length. Whereas muscle Y may have a smaller moment arm, but is at a near optimal operating length. Muscle Y might actually produce more force and be more useful despite its leverage disadvantage, which could lead to actual recruitment patterns that diverge from a simple moment arm ranking.
So this is a great point, and it's a fun little rabbit hole to go down, because I've actually gone down this rabbit. My first thought was, okay, there's got to be other structural properties of the muscle that change its metabolic efficiency, right? In other words, by the way, for the audience, again, whenever we talk about metabolic efficiency, we are talking about a very specific ratio. We are talking about the amount of torque that a muscle can produce in relation to the amount of energy that it costs to activate all of those muscle fibers that is producing that torque. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolic efficiency. So that would mean that things that don't have anything to do with activation change the amount of torque a muscle can generate. And one of those big things is internal moment arm, like we were saying before. But another thing that has to change the amount of force that your muscles are able to produce for the amount of activation required is the length to tension relationship, right? It's not just the active length to tension relationship, which means that more cross bridges are formed. When the muscles are at their optimal length, there's more myosin-actin overlap, right? So for the audience, imagine pieces of Velcro, right? I don't have Velcro lying around, but imagine 2 pieces of Velcro, right? And you've got Velcro here, and you've got Velcro here, but no Velcro here, right? And no Velcro here. So there's an optimal length where that Velcro is going to be stacked on one another, and there's going to be the most amount of Velcro overlap. You go too close, there's not as much Velcro overlap. If you go too far, not as much Velcro overlap. So that's the active length to tension relationship, okay? The passive tension relationship, though, is a little bit different, right? And the passive tension relationship has to do with structures like titin, right? Structures like fascia, things that are part of the muscle that stretch and provide a little bit of what we call passive tension in response to being stretched, meaning they don't require any energy to contribute joint torque, right? If I stretch my elbow far enough back, right, it's just going to snap back without me having to actually activate any muscles, and that's due to the elastic components of the muscle in the tendon unit. Okay, so what we're saying is that the length to tension relationship, both the active length to tension relationship and the passive tension relationship, changes how much force we're able to actually produce for the amount of activation that we need, and therefore the amount of ATP usage, right? So a good way to think about that is, let's say I'm doing an exercise where one of my muscles is at a very shortened length, and another one of my muscles is at its optimal length to tension relationship, but the shortened muscle might have a little bit more leverage. What we're saying is, could that gap be made up for by the muscle that has a little bit better of a length to tension relationship? And when you ask Beardsley that, Enzo, do you know his response to that? Because I do. I know what his response is.
Have you asked him that question?
I've asked him that question and I got blocked for it, but other people have asked him that question too, I believe. No. I asked him that question in his DMs and I got blocked on Instagram. Then I asked him that question in his comment section on TikTok, and he dedicated an entire TikTok video to me. So thank you, Chris. But essentially what his argument to that is, what his response is that, and this again goes to the limitations that you brought up before, Enzo, the fact that we don't have EMG data on like a maximal effort, contraction with a preceding stretch, to activate the length tension with the passive tension, all these other things that, right? We don't have maximal activation studies, so we don't know what happens. But his argument is twofold. One, that if this were true, we wouldn't be able to see sarcomerogenesis. And his idea behind that is that if the nervous system optimized for length to tension relationship, then it would select motor units that are on the plateau of that length to tension relationship. and therefore there would be no sarcomeres added in series, because as soon as you got out of that length attention relationship, the central nervous system would go ahead and recruit muscles that are in that length attention relationship instead. Does that make sense? So sarcomerogenesis wouldn't be observed.
Couldn't that be ignoring the passive structures, though, that contribute to the rebound effect that could lead to the central nervous system possibly choosing to recruit a muscle on the ascending limb?
Exactly. And so that was my question, right? And so I don't think he had a response to that specifically, but I did a little bit of dig because, I like to now anticipate stuff because Beardsley's done his reading, obviously. So I got to do my reading too. And I did a little bit of digging to go and see, okay, do we have any studies on what happens when a muscle is like pre-stretched or preloaded and we have like a lot of passive tension contributing to that muscle's movement? So if the nervous system was selecting for that, what we should see is a jump in activation, right? We should see that muscle get activated more. And what we actually see is that muscle gets activated less. So when there's and the reason why it's activated less is because for the same power output, the nervous system realizes, hey, we don't have to, so I can activate this muscle with less activation and receive the same torque. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't go, oh, this is more efficient, so let me preferentially send activation there. But again, this was only tested in very low effort situations. We don't know how this would operate in a max effort situation, because in a max effort situation, the nervous system would have no reason to hold anything back. It would have no reason to go, oh, we don't need to try as hard. So then how would it change motor unit recruitment? Right?
Because those passive structures on top of the brain fully firing could possibly lead to an overall greater force output that just wouldn't really be worth the metabolic cost in submaximal conditions.
Exactly, which is going to be 99% of real life situations, and also the ones, by the way, that biomechanists are going to be the most interested in, because that's where we're talking about, the area of sports, right? Very rarely do we see a true max effort in sports. We see a true max effort in Olympic lifting and powerlifting. That's pretty much it. And strongman, maybe, right? Everything that makes money is not about max efforts, right? It's about real life contraction, like real life dynamic contractions, eccentric contractions, concentric contractions, the stretch shortening cycle, which I think is very important too. Like, don't you think that there would be a difference between a muscle being activated from a standstill, from a stretch, versus a muscle being rapidly stretched and contracted very, extremely hard to make use of the stretch shortening cycle, right? Like, there's got to be a bunch of other things that, have a real life involvement, because now we're adding in external momentum. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So again, in submaximal situations, the body goes, oh yeah, we don't need to activate that as much to get as much torque. We're going to go ahead and activate it less. That's what it seems like it's doing. But it's not. What it's not doing is it's not going and saying, okay, let me go and activate another muscle. Let me send that energy that I don't have to use. Let me send that to another set of motor units. It doesn't do that. The whole activation is lower.
Would you argue that is probably the most important aspect of the research that we don't have in order to validate neuromechanical matching? Would you say there are other factors that are more important?
Max effort studies. Max effort studies is definitely one of the most important things. Not because the respiratory muscle study was invalid, and by the way, we did that because it actually says a lot of really useful, interesting things. But not because the respiratory study is invalid, but because everything that Beardsley talks about when he references these studies, they all say that the type of task that you're doing, the type of muscle contraction that you're doing, changes the architectural properties of the muscle itself. Different architectural properties. The tendon compliance matters. The fascicle specific compliance matters. The Pennation Angle matters. All of these things, they change. Their interactions change during concentric contractions, eccentric contractions, isometric contractions, whether or not there's a rapid stretch shortening cycle. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you spent a lot of time going over that lung study. So if you'd like to take it away and go into a little bit more depth on that, feel free.
Okay, yeah, sure. I would love to do that. So let me just look through some of my notes here, because I basically read this whole paper in depth. So this was the review, okay? Not the actual lung study itself that I read entirely, although I did go into that a little bit. But I went into the review from Hudson et al., 2019, okay? So this is from the Exercise Sports Science Journal, okay? So this is the 2019 study, or review. And I was trying to kind of like unpack a little bit of the terminology that we're using to try to figure out, okay, basically, like, can we get like a literature review of neuromechanical matching? Because basically what I've seen is, like, basically Beardsley is like, well, somebody needs to come up with a model. And I've heard biomechanists say we do have a better model. At least we don't have one that's been communicated to them. And I think the reason why is because before we even do that, we need to build kind of a literature review of our own that kind of takes into account, a more objective view of what's been going on in these neuromechanical matching studies that Beardsley is referencing. What lens are they actually, the researchers, looking at through? Because Beardsley talks about all the time, the lens that you're looking through matters so much. Like, what you're studying for, that adds weight to the evidence. It's like, I agree. If you're specifically trying to study that thing, you're likely to divert more resources to better understanding that thing. So I agree. So we should apply that standard, to neuromechanical matching and really see, okay, what are the authors that we base this theory on? What are they saying about it? What are the factors that they're taking into account? So this is kind of my attempt at getting that literature review started. I'm going to 2009 paper to look through what they're saying, and we unpack a few important things that they're talking about. Okay, so one of the biggest key principles is something that we touched on earlier, which was mechanical advantage. Okay, so what they're looking at is the mechanical advantage of the inspiratory muscles. So that would be the intercostal muscles that are responsible for inhaling. And they're looking at the order of how it's activated. Okay, and so what they're looking at with mechanical advantage is not just internal moment arm length. What they're actually looking at is the length change again of the muscle fascicles for the amount of basically pressure, lung pressure, right? So they're measuring it by not joint angle change because there's no defined axis of rotation, but they're going, okay, if we have a deeper breath, there's going to be more pressure, right? That's obvious. So what they're calculating is the amount that the fascicle changes for the amount of internal pressure that they can produce. I don't know if that makes sense. Enzo, did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so that was clear. The way that they're measuring mechanical in the respiratory muscles is very similar to the way that they mechanical advantage for the Kawakami study. So just so that the audience is clear, the Kawakami study didn't directly calculate mechanical. What it calculated was the raw data of how much fascicle length change there was and how much joint angle change there was. And what Hudson and Butler did in their 2019 review, where they included that calf study, is they went and took that data and they took the joint angle change and they simply divided it, or I'm sorry, they took the muscle length change, the fascicle length change, and they just simply divided it by the joint's angle change. Okay, and that was how they determined mechanical advantage. So, for example, they found that with a fixed knee, like a straight knee, 0 degrees of flexion, that the medial gastrocnemius had a 0.42 millimeter per degree, or was it nanometer? No, millimeter. Yeah, nanometer wouldn't make fucking sense. A millimeter per degree mechanical advantage, whereas the soleus had, I think it was like 0.11, right? So what they're saying is that there was a lot more joint movement produced per the amount of shortening from the muscle that was required. And that's how they're determining mechanical advantage. Now, interestingly, when you read that paper by Hudson and Butler, the 2019 one, they don't claim to really actually know how much each one of these little factors that plays into that ratio, the shortening for, because there's a lot of different things that influence the shortening for joint rotation. Okay, there's a lot of things that influence that ratio. They don't know the exact proportion of all these factors and how much they contribute, but they list a lot of factors. And some of the factors that they explicitly list that they say go into mechanical advantage are some of the ones that Enzo mentioned, but we'll go into them again. The length to tension relationship, obviously. Okay, the physiological cross-sectional area. Okay, the pennation angle, the shortening velocity, which is related to pennation angle, the specific tension. In other words, what type of contraction are we doing? Right? There's different types of tension: isometric, eccentric, concentric, and the internal moment arm length. So that is mentioned, but it's not the primary thing.
Yeah, so that's interesting because in the introduction of the Kawakami paper, I'm going to read a quote. In pennate muscles, fascicles are arranged obliquely with respect to the tendon, and this angulation changes by contraction. Their forces exerted by muscle fibers are therefore modified at the fascicle level to characterize the force-generating capabilities of a muscle. Pennate muscles also have long tendons and aponeuroses with substantial compliance, which modulate the force-generating capabilities of a muscle by causing changes in fascicle length as force is exerted at a given joint angle. These factors make it difficult to estimate muscle actions from sole observation of joint performance.
Right.
It seems that they acknowledged that pennation does muddy the waters of judging recruitment. And
yeah, I don't think they just acknowledged it, Enzo. I think they were fixated on that with the entire Kawakami paper. That's all they cared about was pennation angle. They didn't even look at internal moment arm length in that paper.
And we can go a little bit deeper into how pennation may possibly impact recruitment.
So if we can visualize that for the audience, when we're talking about pennation angle, right?
Yeah.
So let's just visualize that, because I think a lot of people will have kind of trouble visualizing this in their head and unpacking this. Not everyone's visual, okay? Or not everyone's audio. So imagine this as like your little muscle fiber, okay? So we can have a muscle fiber that is basically what's fusiform, right? Enzo would be the term?
Yeah.
Fusiform, which means it's going to run from tendon to tendon, right? It's just going to be one long thing. And it's going to pull from end to end. It's going to shorten like this, okay? So you can imagine that when it shortens, it's going to be able to basically all of the force that it shortens with is going to be applied directly to tendons, and it's going to cause a shortening of the joints.
Yes.
Okay, now imagine instead of the muscle being fusiform like this, it's made up of a bunch of fibers that attach in like this, okay, to the structure in here. It's pennate. So you have a bipennate muscle would have fiber that goes like this and a fiber that goes like that. So that would be like the calf. So now as this thing shortens, right, it is going to pull this up because it's got a force vector to go up, but it's also going to kind of pull it laterally. And so some of that force is going to be lost. It's not going to contribute to the actual shortening. Yeah, it shouldn't even make it to the tendon.
And so as pennation angle increases, the amount of fiber force transmitted through the tendon reduces, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So at smaller to moderate pennation angles, the increase in fiber force from the slower velocity can outweigh the loss in cosine, and the tendon force per fiber can actually go up compared to fusiform. But at higher pennation angles, the cosine loss will start to dominate, and even though the fiber force is higher, not enough will transmit, and the tendon force per fiber will drop.
Right. So what we're also saying, right, guys, is that the pennation angle, basically as a muscle gets more pennate, its shortening velocity, aka how quickly it shortens, also decreases. And what that means is that because, tension is on the force velocity curve, right? The slower shortening speed means it's producing more force. So it's actually going to be stronger to a point where the angle where, you're losing that force efficiency outweighs the amount of extra force it's producing via the shortening speed. That's what we're saying.
Another fascinating point about pennation angle as well is that muscles can adapt to their architecture and function in response to training. So it's possible that a muscle that grows can become more pennate, and that may impact the level of recruitment that it receives from the central nervous system. And it is important to know that the central nervous system doesn't directly know if a muscle is pennated, but through afferent feedback, we're able to know the amount of force we exerted. So with that, the central nervous system presumably can make a distinction on where they're able to generate the highest amount of force.
Right. Yeah. So that's another important thing, right? So the way that it's framed right now, a lot of people think that the nervous system kind of knows which muscle has the best leverage. That's a little bit disingenuous, right? It doesn't know what muscle has the best leverage. Your nervous system is relying on two basic sensory organs to detect specific tensions. And sorry, I said specific tension. I don't really mean that. I mean to detect the amount of tension at the amount of stretch. So what I mean by that is we have a Golgi tendon organ that senses the amount of force that the muscle is being, or the amount of tension that is being applied to a muscle, okay, or the amount of force being applied, okay. We also have a what's called muscle spindles, okay, and what those do is they detect length change, right, of the individual muscle fibers. So what we have is an organ that tells us, how fast the length is changing, and we have another one that's telling us how much it's changing. Okay, and so by combining those two things, your body can basically approximate how much force it needs to produce in response to that stretch, if that makes sense. So it knows force demands. It understands force demands. The other thing that it has as feedback is what's called the corollary discharge, right? Which we talked about a little bit, but it's a piece of afferent feedback which basically it tells your brain how much effort something took. So you generate a command to produce a certain amount of force in the muscle. It generates a copy of that command, and it sends it to the part of your brain that detects effort and says, this is how much effort that took. It's essentially what it is. So your nervous system can kind of piece those two things together. It goes, hey, I'm putting in a disproportionately large effort, which should be a very easy movement. I'm not going to do that because that would be very inefficient.
So are you familiar with Beardsley's refutation to the whole pennation issue? Because I did leave a comment.
Oh, actually, I am.
Yeah, so I did leave a couple of comments on Beardsley's TikTok, and his response was a little bit confusing. So let me pull it up.
I think I actually remember it very vividly, though. I do remember very vividly.
All right,
I think I can summarize it in like a couple sentences.
Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, Enzo and Beardsley went back and forth on TikTok, where Enzo noticed that, hey, pennation angle seems to affect force efficiency, right? As far as how it's transmitted through the tendon and all that stuff. So it should influence metabolic costs per joint torque. So what's the deal? Shouldn't muscles, as they hypertrophy, become theoretically less force efficient, right? And then that might change, right? That might change central nervous system, how it detects efficiency, all these types of things. What Beardsley essentially says is that we have no evidence in the literature, we have evidence to the contrary, to show that pennation angle increase due to hypertrophy has any effect on fiber force transmission efficiency. So in other words, he's saying that we've tested and seen in the literature that as muscle pennate due to hypertrophy, we don't see any loss in efficiency of how much force that fiber transmits through the tendon.
Now that's a little bit difficult. Yeah, I would say that is fair. Yeah. That is what happened, and I would say that's a little bit difficult to reconcile with, given the research that we've done in the past few days.
Yeah. So we're looking at a couple of studies, right, that show that pennation angle has a remarkable effect not only on force efficiency, right, but there might be something here that aligns with activation, which then can give us a direct proxy to understanding some of the other things that might go the system is selecting for motor units. Okay, so so the studies that we have on the screen, we'll just go in order. We got the Fukunaga 1997 study. This was in the Journal of Applied Physiology. So you guys can all go find it, and Enzo's got it on the screen here. Okay, so we're saying that basically, we can get fascicle length and pennation angle and all these things about muscle architecture from cadavers, right? From static imaging, from analyzing dead bodies. But the thing is, there's something called specific tension, which, as we mentioned earlier, was muscles behave differently. The architecture itself behaves differently under different conditions, and those different conditions can be, like we said, eccentric, concentric, isometric, and also under load. Right. And so what we're trying to figure out is dynamically under load, which is the context of weightlifting. How does pennation angle play out and all this stuff? So what did they do? They used real-time ultrasound to measure fascicle length and pennation angle of the vastus lateralis. So they're just estimating based off of ultrasound images what the fascicle length change is and the pennation angle is during both relaxed and isometric tense states. So this is important again because they're not measuring the pennation angle just as a static measurement. They're not going, oh, this is what the pennation angle is. They're measuring it throughout the dynamic contraction using ultrasound imaging. Okay, and so we're noticing that pennation angle, or we're accounting for the fact that pennation angle may change during the course of a dynamic contraction. So they're measuring this on the vastus lateralis, right, one of the quad muscles, during a relaxed state and an isometric tense state across different knee joint angles, right? So Enzo, you read this study a little bit, right? You dug into it a tad, didn't you?
Yeah. So they found that in the vastus lateralis, pennation angle increased as force rose during isometric contractions, and this increase was greater when the knee was closest to extension. And even when the joint angle and overall muscle length were held constant, fascicles shortened during the voluntary contraction. This showed that fascicle behavior and whole muscle tendon unit behavior are not identical. So they didn't report a direct reduction in measured external force output relative to fiber force because they couldn't measure fiber force directly in vivo. But what they concluded was that pennation angle increased during contraction, and geometrically this must reduce the proportion of fiber force transmitted to the tendon due to the cosine.
Right. Okay. Interesting. How did they measure the amount of force that was being produced total? Were they doing some sort of like dynamometer thing?
No, I don't believe they even measured it. They didn't directly measure torque. They just measured the pennation.
Oh, okay, I got you. And activation, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just the conclusion they came
to. And this was 10%, and this was 10% maximum voluntary contraction, right?
Yeah.
So I would have to imagine that at, like, let's say a max effort, like even at 80% effort, it might even change more.
Yeah. But they didn't take any direct force or torque measurements. They're just making the assumption based on the fact that the pennation angle does increase, that due to the cosine, there must be a loss in force transmitted.
Okay, so we have a Fukunaga paper in 1997 where they're already starting off with that assumption. Okay, so let's put a pin in the pennation angle thing because it's going to be very important because this again, we're thinking from the author's perspective here, right? We don't have a lot of direct data on how much pennation angle is going to affect per fiber force transmission. They're very hard, right? If I'm going to do a bicep curl, right? How are you going to measure the amount to one of my thighs? How is any lab going to do that, right? So it's very difficult. So the best we can do is make some inference. Right, and so that's what Beardsley's doing. Is he's making inferences that pennation angle has no effect. All right, so what are the inferences that these physiologist authors are making? Well, they're not making the same inferences from where I can see, because what I'm looking at is that, remember when we were talking about mechanical advantage versus leverage? Okay, so mechanical advantage, what is that? That's the amount of fascicle length change for the amount of joint angle change, right? Okay, measuring it that way yields results that are not only different but sometimes compete with the results of what you would expect if you just measured moment arm length. Right? And the reason why is because of tendon compliance as well as pennation angle, right? Pennation angle is going to affect the shortening of a fiber for the joint angle change that there is, okay? So there's a big study that was done by Wakeling and et al. What they were measuring was the amount of, literally just that, the amount of joint rotation that would accompany a certain fascicle length change. And what they found was that when you measure the mechanical advantage as the fascicle length change per the degree of joint torque change, that the pennation angle highly affected the amount of shortening that there was for the amount of joint angle change. My point that I'm getting at is that mechanical advantage, the way that the authors calculate mechanical advantage, is different from how Beardsley defines mechanical advantage, which is leverage, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that won't matter. That doesn't matter if mechanical advantage and leverage line up. You can call it one or the other, it's semantics. But if they don't line up, then it matters, right? It's a problem.
Right.
Because mechanical advantage is what the nervous system cares about. It doesn't care about leverage. It cares about mechanical advantage, which means that if we measure mechanical advantage to account all of these things, including pennation angle, then we have something that contradicts leverage, because now all of these things are going to lead to a different reading of mechanical advantage than if you just looked at internal moment arm lengths. And so the study that I'm looking at showed that, in fact, yes, pennation angle does change the amount of mechanical advantage, meaning the amount of fascicle shortening, because that can be measured. I can't measure the amount of force that muscle fiber is producing while I'm doing a bicep curl, but I can take somebody's joint, go like this, and measure the amount of fascicle length change. I can do that. So then I can, by the proxy of calculating mechanical advantage from fascicle length change over joint rotation. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and you're saying that Wakeling's ultrasound basically showed that when joints were rotating, the fascicles didn't lengthen and shorten in proportion to the MTU change.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Which would mean that if leverage was true, that could be the case, right? Because leverage is about MTU, muscle tendon units.
Yeah.
Right? According to Beardsley himself, right? Which, I mean, he says this, so I'm not cherry picking anything. I'm not strawmanning. He says this: pennation angle has nothing to do with line of pull, right? And he's right. Pennation angle doesn't have to do with line of pull. Pennation angle is about fascicles. Line of pull is about the muscle fiber and its muscle tendon unit direction, right? And so more pennate muscles make it so that there's literally a discrepancy, right? In what we just said in fascicle shortening, right, for the amounts of joint rotation that's inconsistent with the muscle tendon unit, right? If we look at the muscle tendon unit, it shortens way more, right? It shortens way less, I should say, right? Than the fascicle. The fascicle shortens more. The muscle tendon unit shortens less, right? So, yeah.
And also, his concept of architectural gearing shows that fascicle velocity versus joint velocity isn't fixed. So with a low load, it can lead to higher gearing. So fascicles could shorten a lot and the joint moves little, which would be more efficient for speed. But with higher load, it might be low gearing. Fascicle may be shortening more directly, mapping to joint motion, and that may be more efficient for force.
Right. So let's go into gearing for a second, because I feel like this all it comes back around to task specificity. It's the big gap that we have in the literature right now is max effort studies. It's just very hard to get those. We don't really know what's going on motor during max effort contractions because we just don't have that many. So like when we're talking about fascicle shortening, depending on the task, right? Gearing, right? What's that all about? When we talk about gearing, okay, that's a concept that's in the Wakeling paper. Okay, do you want to explain it a little bit, Enzo, or should I?
All right. So architectural gearing is defined by Wakeling as the velocity of a muscle belly over the velocity of a fascicle. So it describes how much whole muscle shortening velocity is produced for a given fascicle shortening velocity. Higher gearing means the muscle belly shortens and lengthens a lot relative to the fascicle shortening. Low gearing means that the fascicle shortening maps almost directly to the muscle belly change. So like a fascicle shortens when its sarcomeres contract. And if fascicles were arranged in parallel, right, then with the tendon, then
like this. Yep.
Yeah, then the velocity of the muscle belly would be the same as the velocity of the fascicle. But in pennate muscles, fascicles sit at an angle to the tendon. So as a fascicle shortens, it rotates and its pennation angle increases. And this rotation means a portion of the fascicle shortening is redirected into the muscle belly shortening. And
right. So what we're saying is as the fascicle shortens, it goes like this, right?
Yeah.
It goes like this. It doesn't just go like this. It goes like this. Okay.
And the effect is basically the muscle belly shortens faster than the fascicle. So the gearing ratio is greater than 1.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yep.
So muscles are also nearly incompressible. If they shorten in one direction, they have to expand in another. So as fascicle shortens, the muscle belly bulges outward. And this bulging will alter pennation even more, amplifying how the fascicle shortening is converted into muscle belly shortening. So this is like the 3D gearing effect that Wakeling was modeling. And under low loads, fascicles can rotate and muscle belly can bulge freely. High gearing, 1.2 to 1.4, sometimes even higher, muscle belly moves quickly relative to fascicles. And under high load, the bulging and rotation are mechanically constrained, and fascicle shortening maps more directly to the belly. So gearing approaches around 1, and that's more efficient for transmitting force. And the net effect is really like pennation and bulging act like a gearbox, where the muscle can shift between high gear with a fast joint velocity and less efficient force transmission, and low gear with a slower joint velocity and more efficient force transmission. So that means that muscles aren't locked into one efficiency mode, and they dynamically adapt their architecture to the demands of the task. And the cost is that some fascicle work is always lost internally, but the payoff is versatility.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, that goes kind of with the force velocity curve as well.
Yeah.
Right. When it's shortening slower, you can apply more force, not just because of more cross bridging apparently, but also because of the way that the fascicle rotation works as well, and the muscle belly shape. Interesting. Okay.
I was just saying, what kind of implications does this have?
At max efforts, that would be less relevant, right? Theoretically, because there's there's a slower shortening velocity, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but the gearing effect though shows that there's a specificity element to it, right?
Yeah, I definitely suggest that there's a task dependence.
Okay. Yeah, there's a task dependence, and it might not be dependent on like the task as far as like mental, like what you intend, but it depends on like the speed of the movement that you're doing and things like that. Yeah. But in any case, mechanical advantage clearly changes. Like the discrepancy between mechanical advantage and leverage really changes depending on what type of muscle it is and what type of contraction you're doing, right? And then how much load is being applied. So there's all these different factors that actually influence mechanical advantage that can make it not line up with leverage. And if it doesn't, then that's a problem, right? Because if we're always doing everything, think about leverage, right? But the central nervous system doesn't care about leverage; it cares about advantage. Then we might end up doing things that are suboptimal. That's the implications of that.
Yeah.
Right. It's like if there are things other than leverage that are architectural to the muscle that change the amount of metabolic efficiency at any point during the movement, then that needs to be taken into account. And also that assumption in of itself that the nervous system is always selecting for metabolic efficiency, that needs to be questioned too, because that's not necessarily clear. And the biggest gap that we have in the research right now, I think, is really just max effort studies.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's just hard to figure out what's going on. Right.
I think another interesting implication of this study as well is that if muscle architecture genuinely is a factor that the CNS may consider with efficiency, we know that training can shift muscle architecture. So that means training may bias different results. Hypertrophy with greater pennation may lead to higher force potential, but more per fiber inefficiency. And fascicle lengthening from more lengthened training may lead to higher velocity potential. So different training styles may literally re-gear muscles, changing how they balance force versus velocity entirely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we don't know because, again, how are we going to have somebody do a max effort squat and then figure out what's going on while they're doing that, right? We can't. We use dynamometer isometric for a reason. It's because that's the easiest thing to measure. right? It's so impractical to put somebody in a real life strength training situation and test for neuromechanical matching. It's why Beardsley can go and say, oh, look at all the papers they test, and it's shit like the finger flexor study. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, but do you want to go a little bit deeper into it? Do you think it's relevant?
It was another Hudson and Butler bit. Yeah, I think so. We should check it out for sure. So the finger flexor study was something that, let me pull this up again. Finger flexor study was something that Butler and Hudson and all of them did to measure activation depending on lever. So in this one, they did measure turn, and this was actually the only thing they measured. And what they found was that the EMG lined up perfectly with the internal molar arm length for the finger flexors. I mean, that's essentially it. Now, what they said was that in that paper, there were likely other contributing factors and mechanical efficiency besides length, but they were probably pretty small. That's what they said. My problem is that that's for the finger flexors. That's the only one where they draw that conclusion, right? For everything else, they're like, oh, it could be a bunch of different things for just internal molar arm length, right? And my theory for that is because the fingers move in a pretty limited range of motion. There's not really a voluntary activation deficit. You know what I mean? It's literally just like, it's as simple of a muscle as you can get. Right. So I just don't think that it's a single joint, right? It's not it doesn't do joints, right?
It's just fusiform.
Yeah. It's more fusiform. I just don't think that
it's a prime candidate for neuromechanical matching.
That's a great way to put it. I don't think that you're going to find a much better candidate. Yeah.
Sorry. Repeat that last sentence you made. I'm sorry. You just completely went mute.
No, my bad. I was saying, yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I don't think you're going to find a much better candidate for neuromechanical matching than finger flexors, right? Because what else would the body be taking into account other than internal molar arm length, right? They're made for fine, what's it called? Fine motor skills, right? We're supposed to be writing and shit with our fingers, right? We're supposed to be doing small little, we're not, gripping shit and crushing it, right? That's not what we evolved to do.
Yeah.
Right. So the finger flexors probably they're so wired for just efficiency.
So that study, although it being the prime candidate for neuromechanical matching, does support Beardsley's description of how the CNS recruits motor units.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the ones that he references all the time. So that one absolutely lines up.
There isn't as much literature on muscles with
that's right.
Non-linear architecture.
It hasn't been right. It hasn't been directly tested on that, that big of a variety of different muscles. And in the way that it's been tested, like he'll reference like the deltoids, for example. Well, they tested general regions like the front, side, and rear. Of course, we're going to see no rear delta activation, right? Of course. So it's like how deep and granular do we really want to go? Right?
It's not going to see rear delta activation in an exercise that the front delta is more likely to do.
Yeah, the front deltas, of course, we're not going to see rear delta activation there. Of course, that's going to line up. You know what I mean? Yeah. And of course, we're going to see some side delta, but not that's common sense, right? It doesn't tell us anything we don't already, right? And it doesn't tell us anything that we would go, oh, that confirms our mechanical matching, because all that shows is a directional consistency that internal molar is an important factor. I don't think anyone is disputing that, right? I'm sure internal molar arm length is a very important factor, right? It has to be an important factor. But the idea that it's the only one, right? You can't be looking at muscles that are just all the same. Like they don't have, very distinct muscle architectures depending on the different, they're pretty much all the same, right? So then, of course, the biggest factor there is going to be internal molar arm length, right? But when we look at muscles that are more pennate, right, and we look at the fibers and they're oriented, suddenly now there's a different kind of picture because, even in pennate muscles, all the fast pennated, right? So there's all of these different things to consider with non-fusiform muscles that have, different lengths and stuff like that. You have to think about the muscle bellies themselves. That's going to be, that's going to be a different factor too. The muscle's long and flat versus has a belly, that's going to change the way that the mechanics interact. There's so many different things beyond just molar arm length. And
this reminds me a lot of my conversation with Baxam, who was an engineer. So when you go deep with him on his view on neuromechanical matching, it seems very logical to him because from his physics background, really the only thing that he has to consider is force. And to him, muscles operate, in the video that I recorded with him, he says, to me, muscles operate like springs because the way I know physics is through springs and rubber bands. So to Baxam, it makes perfect logical sense that the central nervous system would take into account the internal molar arm length.
Yeah, if I got a spring here and I got a spring here, I'm going to use the spring here.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
The only problem, which Baxam himself admitted, was that we can't expect a one-to-one comparison from physics in the world outside of the human body to something as absurd as the human body. And as we know, with a lot of an issue begins to develop when you start to view neuromechanical matching from a purely physics efficiency lens, because there are so many aspects to biology that don't translate linearly to machines.
Right. Yep. And that's the case with muscle architecture too. So I just want to drive this point home for anybody because we've said a lot of different things throughout this podcast episode so far, and if anybody's lost in the weeds, this is what it boils down to, right? There are properties of the muscle that are mechanical, meaning that it doesn't require any sort of chemical process to have a certain advantage. It doesn't require any energy to gain that. It just has it inherently. There are a lot of different things that are architecturally part of a muscle structure that will influence that advantage. One of those things is something as simple as where it connects through the tendon onto the bone, right, in relation to the joint axis, right? And that's a big one too. A bigger internal molar arm length, that's huge, right? That's why I think Beardsley harps on so much, is because, like, I don't know if you guys have ever done any cuffed exercises, but you'll notice if you take that cuff that was here and you put it an inch or two down, you'll notice what that does. Like, you can crank out significantly more reps. You get a lot stronger because that's how big of a factor moment arm is. It's so big, but it's not the only one. Because, like Enzo said, right, muscles are not a bunch of springs, right? Like you said, not a bunch of rubber bands, right? They've got nonlinear force transmission properties.
They bulge,
They've got all these things.
They stretch tendons.
But yeah, it's there's so many different nonlinear things. It's just, at the end of the day, it's much more practical and much easier to take a more holistic definition of mechanical, which is just to look at, okay, what are we actually interested in? How much work did this fiber have, and how much effect did it have? That's, at the end of the day, what we're concerned with, right? So, if people get nothing else, because we still really have a satisfactory answer on what causes the central nervous system to select for what things. I think the answer is still beyond our pay grade. But what we do understand for sure is that there's a lot of things that go into mechanical advantage, and that having a clear understanding of what is probably really important to understanding this whole debate, because a lot of people still think mechanical advantage is just leverage. Like, it's not. Right, that's really important. If we can drive home that mechanical advantage and leverage is not the same, I think that will open a lot of people's eyes into, okay, there's probably more factors at play here, leverage, because I think, it just makes sense that mechanical advantage is important, right? That makes sense. That seems to make sense to the authors of these biomechanics and physiology papers. But, they themselves seem to be a little bit perplexed as to what exactly all could be contributing to this mechanical advantage. And is it the same for all muscles? I doubt it. I doubt it's the same for all muscles. So,
and at the end of the day,
I don't know, that wraps up my thoughts about it. But
yeah, absolutely. And I would say at the end of the day, Beardsley set the domino effect in motion for us to learn even more about mechanical advantage. And, neuromechanical matching isn't wrong or bullshit or anything like that. We just feel that it's incomplete. And recruitment may not just be governed by internal moment arms alone. It could be shaped by architecture, tendon dynamics, and above all, neural control strategies. If we want to understand muscle recruitment, hypertrophy, or performance, we need to stop treating muscles like static levers and start seeing them as active transmissions, dynamic systems that shift efficiency depending on what the body needs.
Yep. And I think the point about, how recruitment may not just be governed by internal moment arm length alone, I think next time we do an episode, I think we'll probably talk about the Murray study, right? Which is the one that the Muscle Mechanics Lab, remember that account on TikTok?
Oh, the elbow flexors.
He covered. Yeah, the elbow flexors. It clearly doesn't just line up with internal moment arm lengths, right? So what's going on there, right? It deserves some investigation. I think it deserves its due, because everybody's writing it off with crosstalk. That's a code, right? We can't just write everything off with crosstalk. There's something going on. There was significantly more activity in the brachioradialis when the exact opposite should be true of the leverage. What is going on, right? So,
yeah.
But I think that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, and I think we definitely need to spend a lot of time on that study alone in order to give it justice. Dude, thank you so much for coming on. I think we covered a lot of topics for viewers to think about. You want to drop your socials for anybody that's interested?
Yeah, it's literally just form_function_fit on Instagram and TikTok. You can find me both under the same handle. Let's see, Dr. Forums on YouTube, spelled how it sounds. Those 2 words. That's pretty much it.
All right.
Thank you for having me on, bro. This was amazing, by the way. Like, I think this gave us an opportunity to talk about something that just is very under-discussed in the depth that we discussed it in. So thank you for this.
Yeah, I really appreciate that I found somebody on the internet that I can go this deep into nuance with, because I don't experience that very much in my physical life.
Yeah, me neither. Definitely inspired.
All right, well, thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.